Welcome to Things You Don't Know, the podcast that explores little-known facts about well-known people and events, little-known people and events, and the impact they have had, and uncovers facts about well-known things often taken for granted. Before we launch into our exploration of swimwear, we want to clarify a few issues that are bound to come to the mind of some. What am I talking about?
Everyone has individual attractions and preferences, and thankfully the stigma concerning such attractions is lessening. It is time that everyone becomes more accepting of differences instead of thinking that anyone who doesn't share your attractions is perverted or wrong. There is ample evidence to support the reality of differences. As a society, we are cheating ourselves of the richness to be had by accepting and celebrating these differences.
To be abundantly clear, we believe that cishet people, like myself, need to follow or try to follow these kind of guidelines. One, be a listener. When a friend who is a member of the LGBTQ plus community comes to you for support, simply listen to what they want and need. Sometimes that's all they really need. Be open-minded. This means that if you get called out by a member of the LGBTQ plus community over a comment or an action, be open to hearing them out and working on yourself to not perpetuate any phobia or judgment. Another, be inclusive. Don't push away those who are different from you, whether based on their gender identity, sexual orientation, or romantic orientation. And don't assume. Part of being an ally is shutting down the idea of compulsory heterosexuality. Don't assume that everyone you meet is heterosexual and cisgender. Ask people their pronouns when you meet them. Another, defend the LGBTQ community from judgmental people. If a friend or a family member makes a homophobic or transphobic comment, don't hesitate to point out how their comment can be hurtful and talk to them about inclusivity. Although ignorance is not an excuse, it can be fixed. And last, believe that everyone is deserving of respect and dignity. Everyone is a human being, and every human being has feelings. Just because you can't quite comprehend their struggles does not mean you have the right to judge them or push them aside.
Yes, I agree completely, and hope that our listeners and followers will make a sincere effort to follow those guidelines. I can assure you by doing so, your lives will be enriched in so many ways.
Yeah, I agree. I know another possible issue with this podcast, which was brought to my attention by a bisexual female friend of mine who, after reading only the title, questioned if the exploration of swimwear by a male cishet was a cover for a misogynistic sexual objectification. I'm tripping over my tongue there. I assured her that I had been a supporter of equality since the 1960s when I marched for women's rights and later marches with the LGBTQIA plus community. Because of the close relationship I had with her, I asked if she thought that jumping to that question was somewhat misandrogenic. After she reviewed the content, she gave me a welcomed hug and told me I might be right and that she considered my viewpoint to be very sexy, which sort of surprised me. I had to tease her by asking if she saw me as a sex object. We both laughed. The point here is that I'm asking you to withhold judgment until you read the content and feel free to make comments.
Good Lord, Dr. Weaver, I had no idea you were going to get into all of that. But your points are well taken in seriousness, and perhaps they provide a vital, needed clarification. But let's get into the subject of today's podcast, swimwear, without further preamble. The history of swimwear is very convoluted and cyclic for both males and females, moving from swimming naked to head-to-toe body coverage. The ancient Greek and Roman male athletes typically competed in the nude. Females in that era, check out our Spartan podcast to learn more about that, often wore bindings on their breasts and a type of loincloth. Some suggest that this attire can be traced back as far as 5600 BC. Illustrations and mosaics depicting women in bikini-style garments have been found in several locations, the most famous being at the Villa Romana di Casal, as seen in the picture, which dates to ancient Greek and Roman times.
Yeah, two-piece garments for women have been depicted on numerous Greek urns and paintings dating back to 1400, as Rupert Cornwall reported in, let's see, that book, John Litchfield, June 17th, 2006, Boom or Bust, or Boom and Bust, the nuclear age and the bikini age, the independent London is where that appeared. Some men wore a kind of loincloth and a brief combination garment, possibly for support and protection in some kinds of athletic competition. There's no evidence that these garments were used in swimming or sunbathing.
Swimming and outdoor bathing were frowned upon in the Christianized West for many centuries, so there was no need for a bathing suit until the 1700s. The costumes for women were covered from head to foot, with the coverage from the neck often having weighted hems so the garment would not ride up and expose any body parts, such as the legs, God help us all. The costumes were usually made of canvas or wool and were quite restricting and cumbersome. An example from the 1870s is shown in the picture below. It is very interesting that the concern for what was called public decency was and remains quite sexist. Men were required to have far less coverage than women to be considered decent. In fact, men at Oxford University in the UK were permitted to swim naked as late as 1994.
Well, perhaps the most striking exception to the necessity of body covering was the YMCA. From the time the YMCA was founded until the late 1970s, men were required to swim naked for health and hygiene, quote unquote. This requirement supposedly stemmed from the fact that the materials from which swimwear was made, wool mainly, would shed fibers and clog the filtration system of pools. Interesting that it extended into the 70s when garments were not made of wool, but not a point, I guess. Another striking thing is that men were required to have a nude body inspection before they were allowed to swim. During the 1900s, and in particular, women swam in co-ed sessions. The women had to wear swimwear while the men had to swim naked. This curious custom extended into the high schools and the co-ed swimming competitions, where it was not unusual for men to have to be naked and for the women to have some sort of clothing. Sometimes they both swam naked. Interesting.
In other parts of the world, there are separate swimming areas or times for the genders. For example, in Saudi Arabia, women are required to wear the full hijab, except when they're actually swimming.
While this quixotic custom was ongoing, swimming at most public pools and beaches mandated that both sexes wear swimwear. Swimming and sunbathing became more popular, and the requirements for decent swimwear have undergone significant and cyclical changes. For men, the strictures for body covering has always been more lenient, but still have morphed through the years.
Women's swimwear has gone through even more dramatic changes over the years and has been subject to stricter regulation and scrutiny, no pun intended. In the 1800s, women wishing to swim at a beach had to remain fully clothed before entering what was called a changing wagon, in which they changed into swimwear.
And we have a picture of that below.
They looked like small huts on wheels, and they were pulled down to the water where the women exited the wagon directly into the water.
Oh, yes, we couldn't have them parading around. Yes, I say that sarcastically. I hope you folks know that.
As new fabrics became available, swimwear regulations for women changed. Eventually, women were allowed to go swimming without wearing a bathing cap and could expose their lower legs. Still, the beach police, that's a real organization, could measure the height above a woman's knee that was uncovered, and they could be fined if their exposure exceeded community standards. People take that very seriously, and particularly in the past, my friends. I had a friend whose grandmother was actually sentenced to 90 days in prison in the 1930s for wearing a bathing suit with a too revealing neckline in New Jersey. In the 1930s, sleeves were no longer required and scoop necklines on the back became accepted. Swimwear became more form-fitting. Shoulder straps and side vents were in style. World War II brought about greater increased demand for cotton, silk, nylon, wool, and rubber, as well as leather. So in 1942, the U.S. War Production Board issued Regulation L85, which cut the use of natural fibers in clothing and mandated a 10% reduction in the amount of fabric used for women's beachwear. That's from the website Bikini Introduced on the Wayback Machine of the History Channel, archived April 19th, 2009. The bikini, as we know it, was introduced by Lewis Reed on July 5th, 1946. He named his bombshell two-piece bathing suit after the Bikini Atoll Island where the nuclear bomb testing occurred.
In researching this topic, it became glaringly clear that there was more to swimwear fashion than religious or cultural mores. It is not surprising that women's fashion has been strongly influenced by sexist thinking. The perception of females being sex objects and needing the protection and guidance of civic leaders is clear. In addition to the objectifications of females in fashion, this thinking is paralleled in the way society perceives women. It is not wrong or bad to recognize the beauty and sexiness of the female form.
But it's also very important not to limit women and to be thought of as objects, as nice, as only positive. Women are intelligent beings with all levels of emotion. They can express anger and passion, and they can make mistakes and be wicked and wonderful at the same time. And we need to get away from this stereotypical thinking about how they ought to be or what constitutes their role in the world. And this discussion over proper attire is a big part of that, unfortunately.
So what you're saying is that it's important to recognize that women are quite capable of determining what constitutes decent attire for themselves, and that legislation of restrictive standards is not really necessary.
Not at all, and it is insulting and infantilizing to women to do so.
Okay, the objectification of males is not as widely recognized, but is still very much present. When it was acceptable for males to swim nude, it appeared that males had been given permission to do as they wished. However, when it became required for males at the YMCA and in public high schools in the United States of America, it was no longer a matter of choice. It placed men in the role of being objects rather than people. This perspective is supported by the fact that males were forced to have body inspections, specifically genital inspections. At times, these inspections were done by fully dressed female instructors, along with ascribing gender specific attributes without any real evidence or allowing for individual differences, essentially prescribing a culturally correct definition of masculinity. And I might add that while they were being inspected, there was often an audience of females present. Talk about objectification.
So it was almost, to use the Greek word, a peripety, a reversal of intention. We normally think of men ogling and objectifying women. Here was a case possibly of the reverse.
Indeed.
As with so many of our topics, Dr. Weaver, something that on the surface seems minor and routine turns out to have far greater importance than we initially thought.
Indeed. Hopefully, you enjoyed this excursion into the somewhat lighter side of history, although it's really not lighter when you consider the social and cultural implications. And it will be really interesting to see what trends will unfold in the future. We do have a lot of really interesting things coming up, and hopefully you will give us a like, leave a comment. We love to hear from you. Click the reminder bell so that you'll be made aware when we have new things coming your way. Thanks a lot for listening.
Thank you, folks.